Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you all keeping well. Apologies for the lack of no video last week. It was just one of those weeks where time just literally ran out. I had so much to do and I was trying to get on with everything, and we all know what it's like. We all have those times where we have so much to do, try to cram everything in, and you just run out of time. And that's what happened to me last week. So unfortunately the video had to be sacrificed. But I am back this week with another video, and we are back in the Plantagenet timeline. I'm calling it a timeline because my brain likes it. We are back with Berengaria of Navarre, bride and queen to Richard the Lionheart. And if you want to know more, stay right where you are. Berengaria of Navarre was bride to Richard the Lionheart and was the only Queen of England known to never step foot in England. There's not an exact date known of Berengaria's birth, but she was born sometime between 1165 and 1170, and she was named after her grandmother Berengaria of Barcelona. Berengaria's father was Sancho VI, also known as Sancho the Wise, and he had ruled Navarre since 1150 when he was 18 years old, and he was a fierce defender of Navarre's independence from the neighbouring kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. Berengaria's mother was Queen Sancha. I love the fact that her parents are Sancho and Sancha. I love that. Queen Sancha was the daughter of the King of Castile and the former Princess of Aragon. Berengaria was also a fourth generation descendant of Rodrigo Diaz de Viva, I hope I pronounced that right, better known as Al Cid, a military and political leader in Spain during the 11th century. Sancho and Sancha had 6 children together, with Berengaria maybe somewhere in the middle, not quite known where. But her oldest brother, also named Sancho, nicknamed Sancho the Strong, was heir to the throne. Now, Sancho was everything the handsome medieval warrior that history likes to portray. Sancho, was very tall. Now, one anthropologist who studied his remains had suggested that he could have been nearly 7 feet tall. Berengaria's other siblings were brothers Ferdinand and Romero and sisters Constanza and Blanca. Now, Berengaria had a reputation for her intelligence. She also seemed to have been considered very attractive. There was one chronicler, Richard of Devices, who thought that Berengaria was more clever than beautiful. However, most chroniclers seem to have agreed that Berengaria was a beautiful and learned maiden. It is believed that Berengaria had met Richard the Lionheart years before their marriage. They met at a tournament when Richard was still betrothed to Alice, sister to King Philip II of France. Alice was believed to have become a mistress to Richard's father, Henry II, so Richard terminated his betrothal when he became King of England. Richard, along with his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, began arranging a new marriage alliance to Berengaria. Now, Richard needed allies, and with Berengaria's family's connections and Navarre bordering the lands of Aquitaine, Berengaria seemed the perfect choice. Richard already en route to Sicily, Richard has sent his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, south to Pamplona, I hope I pronounced that right, to fetch his new bride-to-be and to bring her to him. Eleanor was in her 60s at this point, and one can only imagine what Berengaria must have thought of meeting Eleanor. Eleanor's scandalous behaviour during the Second Crusade, her 2 marriages, rebelling against her late husband, and her larger-than-life personality, her wealth, had made Eleanor of Aquitaine a legend in her own lifetime. Now, if you are beginning to think or worry that, I'm not going to do a video on Eleanor, don't worry, that will be coming. I admire Eleanor of Aquitaine so much, and through doing since doing Henry II and the Plantagenets, I admire that woman so much. So I want to make sure I can give her the best video that I can do, and she deserves the utmost. So don't worry, a video on Eleanor will be coming soon. Anyway, at Pamplona, Berengaria and Eleanor met for the first time. Now, Berengaria's father, Sancho, hosted a splendid banquet in Eleanor's honour. Afterwards, it was time for Berengaria to say goodbye to her family and join her mother-in-law on the long and perilous journey to Sicily. There's some evidence that suggested that Berengaria didn't have a particularly good relationship with her mother-in-law. In later years after Richard's death, Eleanor would do absolutely nothing to help Berengaria, and Eleanor had a tendency to sideline Berengaria both in public and in private, both then and later. If this were true, the journey from Pamplona to Messina mustn't have been a very enjoyable one or a comfortable one, as they had to pass through the Alps in the winter and across the plains of Lombardy. Eleanor did not allow any time for rest or relaxation. The only stops made were near Milan, when Eleanor had official duties to carry out, and again in Pisa, where she waited for further instructions from Richard. Berengaria's first official appearances were on her journey with Eleanor during their stay at Lodi near Milan, now where they met Heinrich VI, the Holy Roman Emperor. Berengaria and Eleanor reached Sicily at the end of March 1191. Berengaria was described by one chronicler as a wise maiden, noble, brave, and fair, neither false nor disloyal. They arrived in Sicily during Lent, and all marriages were prohibited by canon law, which meant they had to wait for the arrival of Easter before they could legally marry, and Easter was a few weeks away. But during that time, it gave Berengaria the chance to witness Richard's impressive military skills when he captured Messina and forced Tancred, who'd taken control of Sicily. He cheated Richard's sister Joanna out of her inheritance and held on to the inheritance and kept her in prison after the death of her husband William II. Now, Richard forced the release of Joanna from prison, and Joanna was reunited with her mother and brother. And Joanna and Berengaria soon developed a genuine friendship, a friendship that would last for the rest of their lives. Eleanor was unable to stay more than a few days. She had to get back to England to deal with the troublesome John. Now, Berengaria and Joanna and Richard left for the Holy Land, and Berengaria and Joanna's ship had got shipwrecked in a storm on the coast of Cyprus. Now, they were very nearly captured by the ruler Isaac, but Richard got to them before Isaac, and Richard conquered the island, overthrew Isaac, and took control of Cyprus. Berengaria married Richard at Limassol in the chapel of St. George on May the 12th, 1191, by Richard's chaplain Nicholas, who later became the Bishop of Le Mans. Berengaria was crowned queen by John, Bishop of Evora. The newlyweds had spent 3 weeks together before sailing on the 5th of June to Acre. Now, it's unknown if their marriage was ever consummated. Berengaria and Richard's marriage is very much like the marriage between Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon. It's always been debated whether they did or didn't consummate their marriage. Now, for Richard, his sexuality always come into question. It was always debated by some historians, claiming that Richard was a homosexual, although Richard has often been referred to as a notorious womanizer, even having women in his deathbed, although against the advice of his doctors. And Richard had at least one illegitimate child, a son named Philip, who died around 1211. But either way, Berengaria and Richard had no children of their own together. Berengaria followed Richard to the Holy Land. She and Richard's sister, Joanna, stayed in Acre while Richard was fighting. Now, when the crusade failed and Richard come to an agreement with Saladin, Berengaria left with Joanna for France in September 1192. Berengaria didn't see Richard again for 3 years. She and Joanna travelled by sea. They stopped at Rome to pay their respects to Pope Innocent III. They stayed for 6 months as his guest. They then went on to Marseille, accompanied by Alfonso II of Aragon. From there, they progressed through Provence, then on to Poitou, led by Raymond, Count of Toulouse, who Joanna would subsequently marry. They reached Aquitaine when they learned of Richard's capture and imprisonment by the German Emperor Henry VI. Berengaria spent time in Maine. Now, she may have helped to raise Richard's ransom money, but it was Richard's mother, Eleanor, who did most of the fundraising. She worked frantically to get Richard freed, but also to stop John from trying to take the English throne. That woman, honestly, it's just, my hats go off to her. I just freaking love Eleanor. I think she is absolutely amazing. She's one of those women who you wish you just could have just an hour, talk to them for an hour, and you bombard them with questions. Yeah. Anyway, moving on. So, Eleanor left for Germany in December 1193 to pay the ransom money, and Richard was freed, and then he returned to England on March the 12th, 1194. He dealt with John before being crowned again at Winchester on the 17th of April in the presence of his mother rather than his wife. Richard was now being pressured by many, including the Pope, to return to Berengaria and show fidelity to her. Richard was struck with a severe illness, very nearly costing him his life. Now, Richard publicly repented and he rejoined Berengaria for Christmas at Poitiers in 1195, with both going to church every week. Their time together, though, didn't last for very long, as Richard once again left for more battles against Philip II of France. For the next 2 years, Richard gave all of his attention to the building of the huge castle Chateau Gilead. Gilead? Not quite sure how to pronounce that. I always wondered how to pronounce that. Anyway, in Normandy, from where he could defend his lands. In March 1199, during a siege, Richard was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt, and the bolt was eventually extracted, but infection quickly set in. Richard sent for his mother, Eleanor, to be by his side, and Berengaria was not summoned. Richard died on the 6th of April, 1199, aged 41. Berengaria was told of her husband's death by Bishop Hugh of Lincoln. Richard was buried in Fontevraud Abbey at the feet of his father, Henry II, and in Eleanor's presence, and for unknown reasons, Berengaria was not present. After Richard's death, Bishop Hugh of Lincoln was about to join the king, but decided to see Berengaria at Beaufort Castle. and he found Berengaria bereaved and heartbroken after Richard's death. Now, after Richard's funeral, Berengaria headed to Fontevraud to play an important role in the engagement between her sister Blanca and Theobald of Champagne, grandson to Eleanor of Aquitaine. The wedding took place on the 1st of July 1199 in Chartres, and Berengaria acted as witness. In the months following Richard's death, his successor, King John, and his mother Eleanor showed very little concern for Berengaria. Berengaria had to take refuge in her sister's court in Champagne. Now, Pope Innocent III, who had always acted in Berengaria's favour, described Berengaria's situation as a beggar, poor, and humiliated. Things would have been very different for Berengaria if she had given an heir to Richard. Her role as a widow would have her linked at the centre of the power, or as regent, or at very least in charge of their education. But as there's not even anything to say their marriage was ever consummated, Berengaria had only two choices: either remarry or retreat to an abbey or a monastery. It was not an easy situation for Berengaria to be in due to the tensions between England and France. Philip was trying to recover the possessions that the Plantagenets either inherited or conquered in France, and John was losing all of the continental Plantagenet empire. That meant every castle or town that Berengaria decided to live in was at risk of being seized or taken by the French. Berengaria was travelling from one place to another. She was travelling from Beaufort, Chinon, Fontevraud, and Champagne, and in 1204 she finally established a residence in Le Mans. She lived there for the rest of her life. Berengaria reached an agreement with Philip of France. She gave up the places that she had inherited as Richard's widow, Falaise, Donfont, and Bonneville. Recognizing Philip as overlord, in exchange she would receive the city of Le Mans and 1,000 marks. Berengaria didn't use the titles of Duchess of Normandy or Countess of Anjou, instead signing as humblest former Queen of the English. She was later known as the Lady of Le Mans. Financially, Berengaria was almost broke. She never remarried, and John didn't fulfill the dowry she was promised when she married Richard. In the year 1200, they both signed a document where John granted Berengaria 1,000 marks a year, but despite several reclamations and even the Pope intervening on her behalf, King John delayed the payment for many years. Finally, in September 1215, John sent a letter to Berengaria warning about the confidentiality of the negotiations between them. There was then a new agreement, and a new document was signed where John agreed to pay her 2,000 marks plus what he had already owed her. But there was no surprise when a year later, in 1216, John wrote to Berengaria telling her he couldn't pay her because he was bankrupt due to the cost of the war with France. John even had the nerve to say that Berengaria must have understood his reasons in a letter dated on the 8th of June 1216 from John to Berengaria. Quote, Beloved sister, once Queen of England, due to the disruption of our kingdom by the behaviour of our barons, whom the enemy of the human race has incited against us, and moreover by the coming of Louis, fears not God or Church in his to seize our realm. We have already spent most of our money, and every day we spend more and more, having complete faith in your affection at this time of adversity. We earnestly seek your patience and acceptance of the delay of the payment of the money we owe you until such time as by God's will the clouds disappear and this land we rejoice in peace once more. Then the frequency debt owed to our dear sister will be paid joyfully and thankfully. Berengaria's years of fighting and humiliation and the personal intervention of the Pope came to nothing when King John died that same year. Then finally, in 1218, 19 years after her husband's death, after the mediation on Berengaria's behalf, the new Pope, Honorius III, King Henry III, John's son and heir, fulfilled the promises made by his father that John didn't keep. Henry paid Berengaria 4,500 marks over the course of 5 years. In Le Mans, Berengaria spent the last 26 years. She is remembered for her generous contributions to the churches and abbeys of the city. One wrote that she left a persistent fragrance of charity. Berengaria was the benefactor of the Church of Saint Pierre. The church had many clashes with the cathedral town hall even before Berengaria arrived, regarding 6 payments and fines for reluctant payers. Berengaria was strongly voiced for the church's rights before the Pope, and she left the city for a time when the cathedral town hall lifted the interdict against the church. On Berengaria's return to Le Mans, she was warmly greeted and the citizens cheered her all the way home. Berengaria was very popular for her charities and donations to all kinds of institutions dedicated to help the poor and sick. And part of the money Berengaria donated was earned by acquiring property at low prices from the Jews of the city who had been forced to convert to Christianity and to sell the properties below their value. There's very little known of Berengaria's personal life during those years. It is possible that she planned to go back home to Navarre, as Henry III had given her permission to travel back to her homeland, but there isn't any evidence that suggested she did. She did keep in regular contact with her sister Blanca. In 1228, the new King of France, Louis IX, and his mother, Queen Blanche, visited Berengaria at Le Mans. Blanche and Berengaria had formed a friendship, and Louis too was also very fond of Berengaria. Louis referred to Berengaria as our dear, beloved, faithful kinswoman. Berengaria had longed to establish a religious foundation. Now, Queen Blanche was also deeply pious, and she and Louis was keen to help Berengaria's wish. Now, during their visit, they gave her money to help to pay towards an abbey. In August 1228, Louis granted Berengaria 46 acres of woodland, 7 acres of meadow, and 2 acres of gardens bordering the river Lewine, I hope I pronounced that right, at Le Pau. In September that same year, Berengaria bought joined lands and 6 properties from private individuals. Berengaria formally founded the Abbey of Le Pau on the 25th of March 1229 and asked the monks to begin constructing the church. In 1230, Berengaria purchased the vineyard joined with the lands from Alex of Blois. I still can't pronounce that word right after all this time. In May 1230, Blanche and Louis visited to see how the building work was progressing, and later that month, the first abbot and his monks arrived, although the abbey would not be fully completed until 1365. In June 1230, Berengaria purchased 2 watermills. Now, the story goes that she was advised to after the monks' complaint of the noise being made by the mills. Berengaria was told that the sound of them would make the monks think of the money they'd earn and to stop them from their grumbling. At her palace in Le Mans, Berengaria died peacefully, and her last mention in contemporary records was on the 12th of November 1230 when Henry III ordered payment of her dowry. It's believed that Berengaria died on the 20th of December. Berengaria was buried in her abbey, and Berengaria chose her final resting place at Le Pau over Fontevraud with her husband Richard. Berengaria was at her happiest at Le Pau. Berengaria's tomb was not built until the late 13th century. Her effigy shows her crowned and veiled, wearing a tight-sleeved flowing gown. In 1365, a fire swept through the abbey, and Berengaria's tomb was likely to have been damaged. Inside was a chest, was found containing bones believed to be those of Berengaria. Now, in 1602, it was brought into the church and was repaired and moved into the choir in front of the high altar. In 1672, a new epitaph was placed on it, and it read, "The mausoleum of the most serene Berengaria, Queen of the English, distinguished founder of this monastery, was restored and placed in this more majestic spot. The bones from the former tomb were placed inside it." In 1679, a new tomb chest was sculpted. Now, inside were placed the bones from the old tomb, and there was scraps of linen and pieces of gold, embroidered fabric. And in 1920, the contents of the box from inside the tomb were examined. Now, there were several long bones wrapped in linen, 2 matching femurs, part of a left tibia, and a fragment of a femur belonging to a female aged between 15 and 16. Clearly not all of the bones were those of Berengaria. In 1960, a vault containing the remains of a woman were found beneath the chapter house. In 1963, the bones were worked on by experts. Now, they found the bones belonged to a female aged between 60 and 65. The female was about 5'6" and suffered from a dislocated hip. She had a narrow face, a wide forehead, my God, a pointed nose and arched brows, and traces of brass around the skull were found, suggested that a crown had been placed on the head at the original burial, but that had been stolen at some point in the past. The identification of the bones found were believed to be Berengaria. It was controversial, but has now been accepted by most historians that those are in fact the remains of Berengaria. In 1988, Berengaria's effigy was returned to the chapter house at Le Pau and laid on a new tomb chest. It is inscribed, Berengaria, most humble former queen of the English. Now, Berengaria is often remembered as being the only queen of England to never step foot in England. But Berengaria did come to England. She came to England in 1220 for the translation of Thomas Becket's bones in Canterbury, Canterbury Cathedral. Berengaria also attended Westminster for a meeting with either Henry III or Peter de Rouche, who was Henry's justiciar, to talk about her dowry agreement. Berengaria should also be remembered for her not being not being scared or to fight for what she believed in and for what was rightfully hers. She never gave up for that, and that shows what sort of character she was. Her later life as a widow was what was important. Berengaria's stubbornness and willing to fight after being pushed aside and neglected. Berengaria was a success, and she deserves to be remembered other than the Lionheart Queen. And there is the story of Berengaria of Navarre. Yes, she may never have come to England as Richard's queen, but she did in fact visit England. So yeah, there's that. And to be honest, doing the research on Berengaria, I admired her. I admire anyone who's not afraid for standing up to their rights, and especially in the time it was, especially in the 12th century, 13th century, you know. So yes, anyway, there is the story of Berengaria. That's her story. And I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please do hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you get notified every time I've uploaded. And I will be back very soon with another video. Take care. See you all soon.